Neville County Sheriff's Office.
I believe I've seen a dead person. Their face looks all beat up.
I just couldn't understand why somebody would do that.
There's someone going out and killing people. We don't know what the circumstances are.
We were able to review surveillance videos that show this white SUV heading towards our crime scene.
We needed to interview these 3 people and see where they were on the night of the murder.
Let me tell you this, okay? I've got you on video. We've got you on video.
Uncle Johnny, he had come by our house.
I have gifts for my birthday, girls. Oh, good to see you.
And he had brought some birthday gifts for our daughter and for my wife, who have a birthday within 7 days of each other. Uncle Johnny was a very fun guy to be around. He was very welcoming, very warm, and very kind.
Here you go.
We lived about an hour and 30 minutes from my mother's house in Mobile, Alabama, where my Uncle Johnny, my mother, and my grandmother lived. My Uncle Johnny started working as a flight attendant when he lived in Venezuela. He loved to travel around the world, and he got to meet a lot of people. After my Uncle Johnny stopped being a flight attendant, he moved to the United States and started working in the aerospace company as an interior mechanic. He was very social. He was going on dates, but he didn't have a long-time partner at the time.
Finally found Mr. Wright?
No, but hope springs eternal.
Johnny was looking for Mr. Right, if you will.
Maybe one day, yeah.
He had so much to offer, and I think he wanted to share that with someone.
You have a great birthday. Oh, great. Take care. Good to see you. Charlie, gotta go. Don't play late. All right? Say bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Say bye.
Bye-bye.
Dile bye a tío. Neville County Sheriff's Office.
There's a cul-de-sac off of Boiler Road. I believe I've seen a dead person laying there.
Okay.
Their face looks all beat up, and they're laying there on their back. I'm pretty sure it's a human. I didn't get out to look. It was freaking me out a little bit.
All right. We'll get a deputy to meet you there, okay?
Thank you, ma'am.
It took 20 to 30 minutes to get to the scene. I was the commander over Criminal Investigations Division. It was in a remote area, so it was clearly a dump job. It was in a dead end of what was going to be a residential area that never really got developed. So there were no cameras or anything in the immediate scene.
Patrol officers secure the location before the investigators arrive.
What do we have here?
Detective Gazier was the lead investigator assigned to this case.
EMS arrived with patrol officers, and they checked the vitals of the victim, and he was pronounced deceased on the scene.
There was lividity and rigor mortis setting in, so we knew that he had been expired for at least a few hours.
The trauma appeared to be a gunshot wound above his right eye.
There was apparent blunt force trauma to his face with teeth missing. His pants pockets had been turned inside out. There was loose change on the ground.
Looking around further, we found the tooth and a toothbridge. We looked for a cell phone and a wallet and could not find one.
There was a debit card lying near the body, which allowed us to quickly identify the victim.
Johnny Sokies. Run it. See what comes up. Yeah.
We were able to take the name off of the ATM debit card, Mr. Johnny Sokies, and put it into our system. Was able to pull his driver's license picture up and identify him.
Contact the bank, get the bank transaction records.
Our next move was to make contact with Mr. Sokies' family. Johnny's address was about 6 miles away from the crime scene.
Aló.
My grandmother called me.
Abuela, ¿qué pasó?
Very frantically that morning. The cops knocked on her door, and my grandmother doesn't speak any English, so she gave the investigator the phone.
How can I help?
They told me that my uncle had been murdered.
I'll be right there.
When I arrived at the house, the investigators were there, as well as my husband. And then my mother got home.
Mami, siéntate. Mataron a Johnny.
No.
Fue muy difícil, muy doloroso. Johnny era mi hermano. Nos abrazamos y lloramos y no sabíamos qué había pasado.
There's a language barrier with Inui, so Donnie was our translator.
Can you think of anyone who would want to hurt Johnny?
¿Hay alguien que le quiere hacer daño?
No.
Johnny had no enemies. I don't know of anyone that Johnny disagreed with.
Was he in a relationship?
I immediately told them about the dating app and the social media accounts.
Johnny was using the apps to look for relationships and love.
Do you know when he left?
¿Sabe a qué hora se fue?
Inui stated she went to bed around 10 p.m. and Johnny was still watching television. Around 7 a.m., when she woke up, she found Johnny's bedroom door open and the front door unlocked. We asked Inui if Johnny had left in his vehicle, and she said no, that the car was still there. She stated that Johnny had to have left with a friend or someone he knew.
A search of his room and the residence revealed that there was no wallet or cell phone of Mr. Sokies found at his house.
Thank you very much for your help. Nazir.
Meantime, investigators receive a list of Johnny's bank transactions.
Okay.
We made contact with Wells Fargo, and they provided us with Johnny's last transaction, which was a withdrawal from an ATM about 10 minutes away from Johnny's house. That was made at 3:25 a.m. on the morning Johnny was killed. We also found out that the ATM had surveillance, and they advised they would be sending us those surveillance shots the next morning.
Investigators searched Johnny's neighborhood for home security cameras that might reveal when he left home to go to the ATM.
We observed some cameras on a house about 3 houses east of Johnny's residence. We made contact with that resident.
Hey, I'm Deputy Kazir. Can we take a look at the footage from that camera?
We knew Johnny was at the ATM at 3:25, so we started looking at their surveillance footage starting at 3 a.m. She tells us that it's motion activated and that it only picks up when motion such as a vehicle or someone walks by in front of the residence.
Play that part again?
At 3:15, we observed a white mid-sized SUV traveling towards Johnny Soki's house.
Who's behind the wheel?
It didn't show the SUV physically at Mr. Soki's house, but at that particular time, at 3:15 in the morning, most people are asleep. This was the only vehicle in the area.
Pause it there.
The camera captures the partial roadway.
Zoom in there.
We attempted to zoom in to get a description of the driver and the license plate, but it was just too distorted.
We're not able to make out a specific make and model.
We can just get the color of the vehicle and that it was a white SUV.
Play it.
This residence with the surveillance is 3 houses down and just on the opposite side of the street. So we believe as it gets off of the camera angle, it stops at Johnny's residence, picks him up, and then they leave that location.
We knew that he had gotten a ride from someone because we think he's minutes later at the ATM. And this clearly validates that he did leave with another person.
Thanks, Brian.
Investigators review the information from local traffic cameras to try to identify the SUV.
So we gathered data from a tag reader that we have located at Children's Airport near the ATM. The tag reader had picked up a vehicle matching the description from the surveillance camera. This time of morning, that was the only vehicle that passed through the intersection.
We ran the vehicle's license plate to figure out who the registered owner was.
Located that vehicle at an apartment complex, followed that vehicle from the apartment complex to the airport, and then made an investigative stop. I was notified, and then I responded out. There was just one occupant in the vehicle, which was the driver. So I interviewed that individual on the scene at the airport. The driver was identified, and he worked for Allied Taxi Service. I'd asked him if he had picked Johnny up, and he said no. He stated he'd picked up a couple of fares in the area. I asked him what time. He said he picked up a fare from a hotel and then was at the airport at around 3:25.
I went to the airport to gather surveillance footage.
Let's start from 3:25. There it is.
Zoom in there.
The footage showed the taxi driver at the airport at 3:25 dropping fares off.
And we knew that at 3:25, Johnny Soki's and another white SUV were at the Wells Fargo bank withdrawing money. So the taxi driver was telling the truth about what he had done and where he had been. His story was corroborated with video evidence, and he was no longer a person of interest after that.
Okay, thanks.
The next morning, Johnny's family are still coming to terms with what's happened.
No tengo idea por qué un ser humano le quita la vida a otro ser humano, más mi hermano Johnny.
It was very sad and quiet. He was always the loud one, and not having him there and knowing what happened it was really hard for all of us.
seeing his bedroom off the corner of the living room. Knowing that he's never going to walk through the door again was the hardest part.
So on October 26th, the day after Johnny Soke's murder, I received the footage from Wells Fargo of Mr. Soke's transaction.
I got images from the bank.
So we're expecting, a full motion video, but this was just still shots of the transaction.
Show me the first one. That's Johnny.
We see Johnny standing at the ATM holding his phone and his wallet. He's wearing a red shirt, the same red shirt that we found him in at the crime scene.
Show me the next image. Zoom in on the background.
And then we also see this white SUV in the background that matched the description of the surveillance that we had captured from Johnny's neighborhood. This is big. At this point, we knew Johnny had his wallet and his phone on him. And then this also confirms the vehicle that we observed in Johnny's neighborhood as being the vehicle that picked him up.
I think I recognize the model.
We was able to key in on a feature on that vehicle. There was a light that was located underneath the side view mirror. So it appeared to be a Lincoln Aviator.
Go to the next one.
Who's that?
We can see Johnny Soke's in the video with an unknown black male standing behind him and the white SUV in the background behind that male.
This didn't seem right. This individual standing behind Johnny.
Can you clean it up?
This is the best I can get.
We knew that we needed to find out who this individual was.
We want to track where this vehicle came from to look for other video where we could get a visual of the driver of the vehicle.
So at this point, we've established Johnny was picked up at his residence. He had made the withdrawal at the ATM, and then we established the crime scene where Johnny's body was located.
We were able to pull up an aerial map of the subdivision. There's only 2 points of entrance and exit to this neighborhood, and that helped you determine where to canvass for surveillance video.
Deputies searched for security cameras along the route between Johnny's house, the ATM, and the crime scene.
We were able to retrieve surveillance videos from multiple businesses with several different cameras.
Play it.
Palmer's Airport Toyota has a surveillance camera that captures the ATM across the street.
Play that part again.
Zoom in there.
There goes the Lincoln.
At 324, I see the white Lincoln Aviator pull up across the street at the Wells Fargo ATM. And we see Johnny walk to the ATM. He goes back to the car.
Once he leaves the ATM, we need to see which route he took to get to Linda Court.
Bring up the next camera.
We're able to almost live time see the progression of where this vehicle goes.
At 3:27 a.m., the Food Mart on Dawes Road captures the white Lincoln Aviator traveling southwest, which is about a mile from the ATM.
Pause it there and punch in on the plate.
We were unable to get a tag number off of the white Lincoln Aviator.
What else we got?
At 3:31, we observed the white Lincoln Aviator pass in front of Pete's Place, which is about 1.5 miles from Dahl's Food Mart. The vehicle was traveling southwest toward Linda's Court, where Johnny's body was found. So at this point, we have a clear direction of travel, and we believe Johnny's in the vehicle, who is being driven by a male with a blue shirt who could be Johnny's killer.
Investigators received the report from Johnny's autopsy.
Thanks. The autopsy report said that Johnny suffered a gunshot wound above his right eye, and there was a .44 Magnum projectile retrieved from his jaw. He was also beaten so badly his dental bridge broke.
Next day, investigators received the report on the GPS data from Johnny's cell.
Give me those locations.
Johnny's first cell phone ping was at 3:21, which tied into the neighbor's surveillance video across the street of him leaving his neighborhood. The phone continued to ping toward the ATM and then along the route that the white SUV took to the crime scene.
At 3:38 a.m., Johnny's phone pings at Linda Court, where the 911 caller finds his body 8 hours later. But this is not the last ping.
At 4:20 a.m., there's one final ping.
Johnny Soki's phone was powered off at 4:20 around Carroll Plantation and Old Pascagoula Road, which is about 10 to 15 miles from Linda Court, where Johnny Soki's body was discovered.
We believe that this is where the suspect could have went after the crime.
Thanks. Speak. I gotta leave. Let's go.
Investigators zero in on the precise location of the final phone ping.
On October 29th, I was in the area of Old Pascagoula and Carroll Plantation Road attempting to locate Johnny Soki's cell phone when I observed a white Lincoln Aviator parked outside some apartments and was able to observe a tag number on the vehicle. I watch a black male and a white female enter the white Lincoln Aviator. At which point they exit the apartment complex and travel west on Old Pascagoula Road. I stayed at the apartment. Other investigators were able to catch up with the vehicle on Old Pascagoula Road.
It pulls into a local convenience store.
81 clear. 8814 clear.
The female gets out. The driver remains in the car, drives away from the business, gets back on Old Pascagoula Road.
Investigators run the Aviator's license plate. The vehicle is registered to a Kenzie Fisher. She is the passenger inside the vehicle that detectives are surveilling.
We were able to find a relationship to that passenger of a black male with the name of Sabrante Rhodes. And we was able to identify the driver being Sabrante Rhodes. With that information, we were also able to ascertain that he had some active warrants on him.
So as I'm observing the apartment complex, the white Lincoln Aviator returns. Minutes later, a car pulls up next to the Lincoln Aviator.
White male gets out of the car, goes over to the vehicle, gets into the passenger side of the Aviator.
The white Lincoln Aviator drives out of the apartment block. They're then observed traveling just down the street to a business complex where they park in front of a business.
So we conducted a traffic stop on that vehicle. We remove Sobrante from the driver's side, and we remove the white male from the passenger side. We detain the two. From that point, we seal the vehicle, and we have it towed and impounded. We sent another unit to the convenience store, and they detained the female passenger that was dropped off. We needed to interview these 3 people to find out their whereabouts on the night of the murder.
We interviewed the passenger of the white Lincoln Aviator, Connor Moretti.
We asked Connor Moretti who Sobrante Rhodes was to him and how we knew him.
That's the first time I met him. I don't even know his name.
Did you message him or he messaged you?
I messaged him this morning, and then we arranged hookups. Yeah.
Yep.
That's it.
Okay.
He expressed interest. We traded pictures.
It's interesting to see this guy had met Sobrante Rhodes on a dating app, just like Johnny Sokeys did. We asked Connor Moretti if he knew Johnny Sokeys.
Does that guy look familiar to you at all?
He messaged me one time, but I didn't respond.
He's from Venezuela?
I don't know his name. I just know
Would it still be in your phone?
No, because...
How do you know he messaged you?
I remember that face. That's just one of those faces you'll recognize.
You never messaged him back?
Wasn't
Not
interested.
it.
Nothing tight.
After a search of Connor Moretti's cell phone, we observed there was no communication between him and Johnny Sokeys on the night of the murder.
This gentleman had no involvement in the murder of Johnny Sokeys.
So we was able to mark him off the suspect list.
Next, investigators interview Sobrante's girlfriend, Kenzie Fisher.
We asked her where she was on the night of October 24th. She said she was home at her apartment.
What time do you go to sleep that night?
9:30.
Okay.
Now, I have trouble sleeping. If he's not in the bed with me, I usually wake up.
She woken up around 2 a.m. and realized Sobrante was gone.
You get up at 2:02 Friday morning. So you got up. Okay, you look around. Truck's gone.
And she texted him at the time to see where he was.
He was on my way. This is at 2:21.
Some time lapsed, and he was still out. At 3:53 a.m., she texted Sobrante again.
So you sent this message at 3:53. He's not home yet.
I asked her if she suspected him of messing around outside their relationship.
I do.
What's your suspicions of that?
Having a different female.
Why do you think that?
Because he disappears in the middle of the night.
I asked her if Sobrante was seeing men outside of their relationship.
I've never
suspected him of being like that. Never given you any inclinations that he would be sexually attracted to another male.
Okay.
She was quite surprised. So I showed her the surveillance footage from the ATM.
Just tell us if you recognize the person in the picture, what his name is.
It looks like the Sobrante, but I can't make it out.
Yeah. See the vehicle?
Yeah, I do see the vehicle, and that does look like my vehicle.
I felt that she was upfront about her story and where she was that night. She showed us the messages that she was sending Sobrante that night, asking his whereabouts. So that confirmed her alibi. And her messages also confirmed that Sobrante Rhodes was not home on the night of the murder.
Investigators release Sobrante's girlfriend without charge.
Later that day, I interviewed Sobrante Rhodes.
Unrelated to your warrants, we want to talk to you about another case we've been investigating. Are you willing to talk to us?
Yeah, I would on a case.
Okay.
We confronted Sobrante about these dating apps. At first, he was standoffish.
Are you bisexual?
Honestly, I'm not bisexual. I have did it. Yes, I'm bisexual.
Okay.
So I asked Sobrante Rhodes if he met someone by the name of Johnny on the dating app.
I met him on the chat site.
John. John who?
I don't know his last name. Hispanic dude.
Sobrante told us that he had picked Johnny up from his house.
Where'd you meet him at?
I met him at his house.
Okay. Did you take him anywhere?
I took him to the ATM machine.
What ATM did I go to?
On Schilling, Fargo.
Wells Fargo?
I took him right back home. I wasn't gone away from my girl no time.
So I asked Sobrante the route that they had taken.
When I went home, I went back up airport and all the way up Schilling.
All the way down Schilling. You ain't got nowhere else?
Nowhere else.
You should have been back home around 3:30, you saying?
Yeah.
We knew that Sobrante was not telling the truth because we had got video surveillance from Johnny's neighbor that shows Sobrante picking Johnny up but never bringing Johnny back home. So we confronted him with that.
Let me tell you this, okay? We've got you on video going to get Johnny. Got you on video at the ATM with Johnny. Got you on the video leaving the ATM with Johnny. Y'all didn't go directly back home. Y'all went down Dawes Road.
No.
I've got you on video. We've got you on video.
I ain't killed nobody, man. I swear to
Did
God.
Johnny kill himself? Let me ask you, did Johnny kill himself?
I did not kill nobody, man. I did not take that man nowhere. Oh, God, no, I want a lawyer, man.
So Sobrante Rhodes, at that point, asked for a lawyer, and then we ceased the interview.
So at this point, the interview has stopped. The investigators have enough, at which point our office did approve a murder charge for Sobrante Rhodes.
Investigators inform the family of their progress.
Hi. The investigators called me and told me that they found a suspect, the suspect that was driving the car that night.
What's his name?
I had never heard of Sobrante before.
Mi hija Donnie me dijo que había un sospechoso. Tuve fe en ellos que iban a resolver la situación.
I feel like it was relief for Donnie and her mom and grandmother.
It was a sigh of relief to know that this individual was off the streets, but there's still a lot of work to do. We knew Johnny died from a single gunshot wound to the head from the .44 Magnum.
Ideally, you'd have the murder weapon, you'd have anything that caused the death. We didn't have a murder weapon in this case.
Finding this weapon was going to be crucial to closing this case.
Sobrante Rhodes is now in jail, and he's communicating via email with his girlfriend. He starts talking about the gun that was used in Johnny's murder and saying that it is in the possession of someone else. I swear I didn't kill this man. When I left him, he was alive. I bet if they run the gun from that 20-year-old kid that did the shooting at Exxon Mobil in Theodore gas station the other day, it'd be a match. I don't run with this kid, but I seriously think he killed the man I'm charged with killing. I need to see someone. They got me so wrong. Sobrante Rhodes is saying that someone else was involved in this and that he did not do it.
Investigators review the case file for the shooting that Sobrante describes in his email. They discover that Mobile Police Department arrested 20-year-old Cameron Sullivan for an armed assault at an Exxon gas station 8 days after the murder of Johnny Sokis.
I contacted the case agent working the case, and he gave me the details and told me that they collected a .44 Magnum from that shooting.
The gun was then sent to the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences and tested against the bullet that was recovered from Johnny Sokis. It turned out that it was a match, and that was the gun that was used to kill Johnny Sokis.
Is Sobrante the person that killed Johnny? Or could Cameron Sullivan be Johnny's killer? We interviewed Cameron Sullivan. We asked him about the .44 Magnum.
Cameron Sullivan tells detectives that he purchased the gun recovered from the gas station shooting for $100 on October 26th, the day after Johnny's murder.
He then indicated that he had purchased the gun from Sobrante Rhodes.
Cameron Sullivan told us that he was an associate to Sobrante. We was able to ascertain a phone communication between Cameron Sullivan and Sobrante the day after Johnny Soke's murder.
Have you run his phone GPS?
The cell phone analysis of Cameron Sullivan's phone showed that he was out of state on the morning of the murder.
Thanks.
And so we knew he was not the one that killed Johnny Soke's.
Cameron Sullivan is uninvolved in Johnny's murder. Investigators charge him with no crimes in relation to the killing.
Sobrante Rhodes is trying to evade responsibility for Johnny's death. He clearly knows what happened. He's talking about the gun that was used in the murder. But now he's trying to put the gun and the shooting of Johnny on someone else.
Sobrante Rhodes' murder trial begins on May 15th, 2023. He pleads not guilty. Prosecutor Lauren Walsh sets out the chain of events that led to Johnny's murder.
I think Sobrante Rhodes was living a double, if not a triple life. He had a girlfriend who did not know where he was a lot of the time. He was with all kinds of other people she didn't know about. We know that Johnny and Sobrante were meeting up in the early morning hours of October 25th of 2019. We know that they went to the Wells Fargo ATM together, where they were seen on surveillance and where we know Johnny Soke withdrew cash. Sobrante Rhodes did not take Johnny home after that.
I believe that he robbed him. I believe that he stole from him. And executed him. Sobrante killed Johnny Soke's for no reason at all.
We believe Sobrante Rhodes chose Linda Court to dump Johnny's body because it was quiet and secluded with no witnesses.
We know his pockets were empty. We know his phone and his wallet were taken. We know that Johnny Soke's phone, it ultimately last connected where Sobrante Rhodes lived.
Johnny's cell phone and wallet was never recovered. We believe when we detained Sobrante and Canamarate that day, Canamarate could very well have been his next victim.
On May 17th, 2023, the jury finds Sobrante Rhodes guilty of intentional murder. The judge sentences him to life without parole.
When we got the verdict, I felt immense gratification and relief that we were able to secure that conviction and get justice, as well as ensure safety for our community so that the public never has to worry about Sobrante Rhodes offending like that again.
He's a very violent person, and he's right where he belongs.
The surveillance footage was immensely important in investigating this case and ultimately securing the conviction of Sobrante Rhodes. It led us to understand where Johnny Soke was, what vehicle he was in, and ultimately who he was with.
I can't understand why this happened to him.
No verlo en la casa, mirar alrededor y no ver sus risas, sus abrazos, sus besos. Todos los días de mi vida lo extraño.
The fluorescent lights of the abandoned science wing flickered once, casting long, skeletal shadows across a chalkboard untouched for over a decade, before dying out completely and plunging the room back into a heavy, suffocating darkness. In the autumn of 2011, Detroit was a city caught between industrial decay and shifting urban landscapes, a sprawling metropolis where entire city blocks fell silent, and historic brick high schools were boarded up overnight, left to rot in the biting Midwestern wind. For years, the shuttered halls of Cass Tech Academy stood as a hollow monument to a forgotten generation, a playground for urban explorers, copper thieves, and ghosts, until a routine demolition survey ripped open a secret hidden behind the drywall of a third-floor classroom. Behind an old utility closet, wedged tightly into the dead space beside a ventilation shaft, workers discovered a fully intact human skeleton sitting upright, its hollow eye sockets staring blankly into the pitch black. The shocking discovery sent an immediate, visceral jolt through the local precinct, instantly transforming a mundane construction site into a grim, high-stakes forensic theater that captivated a terrified community. This was no ordinary historical artifact. Wrapped around the yellowed ribs were the distinctive, frayed remnants of a navy blue school cardigan, a silver nameplate still pinned to the lapel, and a leather backpack containing textbooks that had not been opened since a freezing Tuesday afternoon in January 2011. Within hours, the whisper echoed through the corridors of the homicide squad. A missing student, a decades-old mystery, and a cold case that was about to drag the city's darkest secrets back into the unforgiving light. The air inside that third-floor classroom was thick, smelling permanently of pulverized plaster, dry rot, and the unmistakable, metallic tang of industrial dust that had settled over a crime scene frozen in time. On January 18, 2011, 16-year-old Marcus Vance was a straight-A student with a brilliant future, a quiet track star who spent his afternoons tutoring classmates and dreaming of an engineering scholarship at the University of Michigan. He had waved goodbye to his mother at the bus stop that morning, his face buried in a woolen scarf against a blinding Michigan blizzard, carrying a heavy backpack that felt like an anchor in the drifting snow. He arrived at school, logged into his first 2 classes, and then, between the second bell transition and the midday lunch rush, he simply vanished from the face of the earth without a single trace. His locker remained locked, his heavy winter coat was left hanging on a hook, and his cell phone pinged a single tower near the school before going completely dead, leaving his frantic family to navigate a labyrinth of rumors and dead ends. For over a decade, his disappearance was a bleeding wound in the heart of the neighborhood, a cold case that mocked the efforts of investigators who combed the city's abandoned warehouses and frozen riverbeds looking for a body that was hidden just feet from where his classmates learned algebra. The structural geometry of the discovery scene suggested a level of sinister calculation that immediately ruled out an accidental entrapment or a tragic, drug-fueled misstep in the dark. The utility closet had been permanently sealed from the outside with heavy plywood sheets during a hasty building renovation project that took place just 3 days after Marcus vanished, meaning the killer knew the school's maintenance schedule perfectly. The forensics team worked with agonizing slowness, utilizing dental tools and soft bristle brushes to clear away the debris surrounding the bones, careful not to disturb the delicate alignment of the remains. There were no signs of bullet holes in the clothing, no massive blunt force trauma to the skull, and no slashes in the fabric that could point to a knife attack, suggesting the mechanism of death was far more silent, intimate, and horrifying. The medical examiner noted distinct, symmetrical fracture lines on the tiny hyoid bone in the throat, an absolute, undeniable indicator of manual strangulation carried out by someone with immense physical strength and a cold, unwavering focus. Marcus had been hunted down in his own school, choked to death in the shadows of a vacant wing, and stuffed into a wall cavity while the bell rang down the hall, signaling the start of the next class period. As the news of the classroom skeleton spread through the Detroit media, the city erupted into a frenzy of speculation, public outrage, and mounting hysteria that targeted the school board and the original investigative task force. Talk radio stations overflowed with frantic calls from former students who remembered the terrifying atmosphere of 2011, an era
when the school was undergoing chaotic budget cuts, security guards were laid off, and entire wings were locked down due to broken heating systems. The realization that a child's body had been decomposing inside a wall for more than a decade, while thousands of students walked past it every single day, sent a shuddering wave of guilt and horror through the entire school district. Detectives began the grueling process of resurrecting the original missing person file, pulling dusty boxes of paperwork from the central archive and rereading the typewritten statements of teachers, administrators, and students who were present on the day Marcus disappeared. The timeline was an absolute mess, a fragmented puzzle of conflicting testimonies where no one could agree on who saw Marcus last, what hallway he was walking down, or who he was talking to before the darkness swallowed him whole. By the winter after the discovery, the initial surge of forensic data had frozen into a grim, stagnant reality as the physical evidence yielded very few immediate answers for the cold case squad. The DNA extracted from the bones was an absolute match for Marcus Vance, confirming the family's worst nightmare, but the clothing samples were too degraded by years of temperature fluctuations and moisture to yield any foreign genetic profiles. The dust that coated the interior of the wall cavity was a mixture of asbestos, pulverized concrete, and decades of environmental particulate matter, obliterating any latent fingerprints or shoe prints the killer might have left behind during the concealment. The investigation was forced to rely on pure shoe leather, with detectives tracking down Marcus's former classmates across the country, conducting long-distance phone interviews with engineers, factory workers, and nurses who were now in their late 20s, trying to spark a memory that had been buried beneath a decade of adult life. Every interview turned out to be a dead end, a collection of vague recollections about a quiet boy who kept to himself, a tragic figure who became a ghost story whispered in the halls after the school closed down. The psychological toll on Marcus's surviving family was a devastating, silent catastrophe that played out in a modest brick bungalow just 3 miles from the shuttered academy. His mother, an aging woman whose face had been hollowed out by 13 years of unremitting grief, sat by her front window every afternoon, staring at the empty street as if the discovery of his bones was merely a bureaucratic mistake. She had kept his bedroom exactly as it was on the morning of the blizzard, his track medals hanging from the curtain rod, his graphic novels stacked on the desk, his winter boots still sitting by the radiator, a domestic shrine to a life that had been frozen in mid-motion. She listened in agonizing silence as the lead detective explained the lack of leads, the absence of a weapon, and the terrifying efficiency of a killer who had managed to commit the perfect crime in a building filled with 1,200 people. The family's despair was a heavy, suffocating entity that filled the room, a stark reminder to law enforcement that every cold case file represents a family condemned to a life sentence of unanswered questions and eternal sorrow. Then came the turning point, a revolutionary breakthrough born from the digital footprint of an old-school computer network that had been decommissioned and stored in a state archive facility. In the spring of 2026, a specialized digital forensics unit partnered with the Cold Case Task Force, utilizing modern data recovery techniques to extract login records and private messaging archives from the school's internal server from January 2011. This wasn't just a list of names. It was a digital landscape of the days leading up to the murder, a virtual archive of teenage rivalries, secret relationships, and hidden threats that had never been shared with the original detectives. Technicians worked side by side for weeks, decrypting corrupted files and reconstructing chat logs that pointed to a specific, highly toxic conflict between Marcus and a senior student named Derek Miller. The digital trail revealed that Marcus had discovered a sophisticated grade-fixing scheme operated by Miller, a star athlete whose entire college future depended on maintaining a pristine academic record that he didn't earn. The name that emerged from the digital matrix sent shockwaves through the local community and the halls of the precinct, shattering the reputation of a prominent public figure. Derek Miller was no longer a high school student. He was a 33-year-old high school principal living a highly respected life in an affluent suburb of Chicago, a pillar of the educational community who spent his weekends organizing youth charity events. To his teachers, colleagues, and students, Miller was an inspirational leader, a man who dedicated his life to helping underprivileged kids stay out of trouble and achieve their academic dreams. Undercover detectives descended on the quiet Illinois suburb, watching the principal through high-powered binoculars as he walked through the school parking lot, waiting for a single piece of abandoned physical evidence that could link him to the bones in the wall. They tracked him to an upscale coffee shop, watching intently as he drank an espresso and discarded a paper cup into a public trash receptacle, leaving behind the modern keys to his ancient kingdom of horror. The laboratory results came back 48 hours later, a perfect, undeniable, 1 in a billion match between the DNA on the coffee cup and a microscopic sample of foreign epithelial cells that had been found preserved inside the lining of Marcus's backpack strap. The Phantom of Cul-De-Sac was no longer a mystery. He was Derek Miller, a man whose entire adult career had been built on the blood of a child he had silenced to protect his own ambitions. The final puzzle piece had fallen into place, revealing a motive so petty, so calculated, and so monstrous that it left the veteran investigators completely speechless. The arrest warrant was signed in total secrecy, a tactical team assembling in the pre-dawn darkness outside Miller's manicured suburban home, preparing to bring a 13-year run of deception to a crashing, violent conclusion. As the police cruisers blocked the ends of the street, Miller awoke not to another successful day as an educator, but to the long-delayed reckoning of a killer whose past had finally tracked him down. The heavy iron doors of the Detroit Detention Center slammed shut behind Derek Miller, a sound that echoed like a thunderclap through the decades of silence that had protected his dark secret. The courtroom during his arraignment was a sea of flashing cameras, frantic reporters, and aging residents from the old neighborhood, all staring at the clean-cut principal who now wore an orange jumpsuit and heavy wrist chains. He sat at the defense table with his head held high, his expression a mask of professional defiance, a man who still believed his status and wealth could insulate him from the consequences of a childhood atrocity. Yet, as the prosecutor read the charges, detailing the digital messages, the grade-fixing scheme, and the brutal mechanics of how Marcus was choked to death in that dark utility closet, the mask began to fracture, revealing the cold, unrepentant predator beneath. The judge denied bail with a slam of her gavel that sounded like a gunshot, ensuring that the man who had spent 13 years hiding behind a badge of respectability would remain locked away from the society he had deceived. Today, the old brick building of Cul-De-Sac Academy is gone, demolished and replaced by a modern community park, but the memory of what transpired behind its walls has finally found a somber, permanent resolution. The conviction of Derek Miller brought a shuddering, emotional conclusion to a cold case that defined a generation of urban fear, proving that time cannot erase the voice of the dead or protect the wicked from the march of modern science. The classroom skeleton did not remain an anonymous tragedy. Marcus Vance became a symbol of unyielding truth, a boy whose brilliance survived the darkness of a wall to drag his killer into the light of a courtroom. In the quiet cemetery where Marcus now rests beneath a headstone that bears his name, the air feels lighter, the heavy burden of unresolved injustice finally lifted by the relentless dedication of those who refused to let his story die. Derek Miller will spend his remaining days behind concrete walls, staring at the ceiling, haunted not by his achievements, but by the knowledge that he was caught, unmasked, and destroyed by the very ghost he left behind in the classroom wall. The morning wind that howled through the shattered window frames of the third-floor science wing carried a freezing dampness, smelling of oxidized iron and long-dead fires, a stark atmospheric echo of the very blizzard that had paralyzed Detroit on the day Marcus Vance disappeared. Inside the classroom, the forensic team worked under the harsh, artificial glare of portable halogen lamps, their hum creating a low, vibrating drone that felt like a pulse inside the stagnant tomb. Every movement was slow, deliberate, and tense, as if the air itself might shatter if disturbed too violently. The lead forensic anthropologist, a woman whose career had been spent cataloging the grim remnants of urban violence, knelt in the pulverized drywall dust, her gloved fingers carefully extracting a small, metallic object from the debris near the skeleton's feet. It was a high school track medal, its silver plating tarnished to a deep, dark charcoal gray, but the engraved lettering on the back remained perfectly legible. City Championship, 2010, first place. It was a devastatingly personal fragment of a life interrupted, a tangible link to the bright, athletic teenager who had walked into this building with a backpack full of dreams and never walked out again. Outside the yellow police tape that cordoned off the skeletal ruins, the hallway was a long, cavernous corridor of rotting ceiling tiles, rusted lockers, and peeling paint, a space that had once echoed with the chaotic energy of thousands of students but was now reduced to an absolute silence. Detectives from the cold case squad moved down the line of lockers, checking the serial numbers against old maintenance logs, trying to find the exact locker that had belonged to Marcus. The school had been abandoned in a rush during the district's sudden financial collapse, left to the mercy of scavengers who had ripped out the copper pipes and aluminum wiring. Yet this specific corner of the third floor had remained strangely untouched, bypassed by the thieves as if an instinctual, unspoken dread had kept them away from the wall closet. The realization that a child had laid dead behind that drywall for 13 winters, while the city outside decayed and rebuilt itself, left a heavy, suffocating sensation in the chests of the investigators, a collective guilt that seemed to demand an immediate, ferocious response from the law. By mid-afternoon, the news of the classroom discovery had leaked past the police perimeter, drawing a crowd of local residents, former students, and community activists who gathered on the cracked asphalt of the old school parking lot, their faces pale with a combination of shock and rising fury. Many remembered the frantic, chaotic search for Marcus back in 2011, a search that had been plagued by media indifference and a systemic lack of resources within a department that was handling dozens of active homicides a week. Rumors flew through the crowd like wildfire, passing from lip to lip with a Dawn Dap, panicked energy. Some claimed the school had known about the body all along. Others whispered that a serial predator had been working on the maintenance staff, while parents looked at their own children with a sudden, visceral terror, realizing that the institutions meant to protect them could just as easily become their graves. The television news vans arrived in force, their hydraulic masts rising into the gray Detroit sky like metallic monuments to a tragedy that was about to turn the city's educational system upside down. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was a war room of analog history colliding with modern forensic urgency, the walls lined with enlarged maps of the 2011 Cass Tech layout, class schedules, and roster lists containing hundreds of names that hadn't been looked at in over a decade. The initial challenge was constructing an airtight timeline of the exact hour Marcus vanished, a task complicated by the fact that the school's physical attendance records from that era had been stored in water-damaged cardboard boxes in a basement archive. Detectives worked in shifts, using hair dryers to dry out the delicate, mold-covered pages, using magnifying glasses to trace the ink checkmarks next to Marcus's name on that fateful Tuesday. The records showed he was marked present for his first period history class and his second period chemistry lab, but by third period geometry, the box next to his name was left blank, marked with a red question mark that had remained unanswered for 13 years. The choice of the third-floor science wing as a dumping ground was not a random act of opportunity. It was a decision made by someone who possessed an intimate, highly detailed knowledge of the building's structural blind spots. During that specific week in January 2011, the third floor was undergoing an emergency asbestos abatement project, meaning the entire wing was sealed off with thick plastic sheeting, and students were strictly forbidden from entering the area. The killer knew that the construction crew was delayed by the historic blizzard, providing a narrow, 3-day window of absolute isolation where a body could be concealed, a wall could be reconstructed, and the smell of death would be entirely masked by the heavy odors of industrial adhesive and wet plaster. It was a chilling revelation that narrowed the suspect pool significantly, shifting the focus away from random street predators or transient intruders and directly toward the people who held the keys to the kingdom, the staff, the contractors, or the high-level students who knew exactly how to navigate the school's hidden geography without triggering the security alarms. As the sun began to set, casting long, crimson rays across the industrial landscape of the city, the medical examiner's preliminary report arrived at the lead detective's desk, its contents confirming the grim, predatory nature of the crime. The fracture patterns on the cervical vertebrae indicated that Marcus had been attacked from behind, his airway cut off with a sudden, overwhelming force that left him unable to cry out or mount an effective defense. There were deep, parallel grooves on the inner surface of the drywall where his fingernails had desperately clawed at the plaster during his final seconds, a horrific detail that painted a vivid picture of a terrifying, claustrophobic struggle in the dark. The killer had stood there in the absolute silence of the abandoned wing, holding the boy until his heart stopped beating, before systematically packing him into the narrow cavity and sealing the wooden door with heavy-duty construction screws, leaving him to transform into a skeleton while the world outside continued to turn. The investigation began to target the maintenance records from that winter, a paper trail that proved to be a labyrinth of shell companies, dissolved contracting firms, and missing ledger books. The school district's financial records from 2011 were notoriously disorganized, an era defined by emergency managers and rapid privatization that made tracking individual workers nearly impossible. Detectives spent consecutive nights in the county record room, tracing the identities of every carpenter, plasterer, and security guard who had access to the third floor during the asbestos project, but every lead seemed to dissolve into an empty phone number or a vacant address. The frustration within the task force was palpable, a simmering anger that grew with every dead end, as they realized that the institutional chaos of Detroit's past was actively working to protect a murderer who had slipped through the cracks of a broken system and vanished into the vast tapestry of ordinary society. In the midst of this administrative stagnation, the cold case squad received an anonymous tip via an encrypted email system, a message that contained a single, chilling sentence that would completely reorient the direction of the hunt. Look at the computers, look at the grades, look at the athlete who didn't play. The message was brief, cryptic, and lacked any identifying data, but it carried an underlying authority that caught the lead detective's attention. It suggested that Marcus's death wasn't an act of random violence or a maintenance worker's dark impulse, but a calculated execution born of a teenage secret, a hidden motive that had been buried beneath the noise of a city in crisis. The digital forensics team was immediately summoned, ordered to break into the old school servers that had been sitting in a storage facility near the riverfront, beginning a deep digital excavation that would eventually lead them directly to the pristine suburbs of Chicago and to the door of a man who believed his high school sins were far beyond the reach of the law. The digital tomb of the Cast Tech server room was a vast, sprawling graveyard of legacy files, corrupted database fragments, and petabytes of data that had not been accessed since the school district shifted to modern cloud architecture. Detective Carver and his team of specialized digital forensic analysts spent 18 hours a day in a windowless room, their eyes locked on glowing monitors that flickered with the cascading green text of reconstructed server logs. They weren't just looking for emails. They were attempting to perform a digital autopsy on the entire social and academic ecosystem of Cast Tech as it existed in January 2011. The server housing the internal student grading portal, the extracurricular activities roster, and the school's internet chat channels held the ghost of Marcus Vance's final days, a fragmented history written in the cold, binary language of an era before social media dominated the teenage mind. As the analysts peeled back the layers of the digital architecture, they uncovered a hidden, highly sophisticated grade-fixing scheme that had operated within the school's academic portal for nearly 2 years. The records showed that a small, exclusive group of students had been gaining unauthorized access to the grading database, altering their final exams and attendance logs to maintain the high GPA requirements necessary for Division I athletic scholarships. Marcus Vance, a brilliant young student with a natural aptitude for computer science, had been assigned a work-study position in the school's technology office. The logs showed he had stumbled upon the administrative backdoor that the fixers were using, a line of corrupted code that allowed an outsider to bypass the district-wide security firewall and manipulate records from any terminal in the building. He hadn't just found a mistake. He had found a criminal enterprise, and the time-stamped metadata indicated he had downloaded the entire evidence trail to a portable thumb drive on the very morning he vanished. The conflict centered on a name that appeared frequently in the metadata as the primary beneficiary of the altered grades, Derek Miller. A star high school athlete, Miller was the golden boy of the school's basketball program, a 6'5" powerhouse whose recruitment profile in 2011 was generating national buzz. If the secret of his grade fixing were exposed, his scholarship offer, his path to the NCAA, and his entire future as a professional athlete would be instantly incinerated. The chat logs, extracted from a hidden, peer-to-peer messaging protocol that Miller's group used to coordinate their activities, provided a chilling, real-time narrative of the tension that had gripped the senior class in the week leading up to Marcus's disappearance. The messages moved from casual, arrogant banter to a focused, violent urgency as the group realized that Marcus had the evidence. He was planning to take it to the principal on the following Monday, and he was being incredibly quiet and evasive about his intentions. The detective team reconstructed the final hours of Marcus Vance's life with a terrifying, step-by-step precision that made the blood run cold. On the morning of January 18, 2011, Marcus arrived at the technology office at 7:30 a.m., his logs showing he was finalizing a report for the school board. At 9:14 a.m., the security camera footage, a grainy, low frame rate loop, showed Miller walking toward the technology office, his posture stiff, his movements purposeful. For the next 30 minutes, the digital logs were silent, but the physical reality of the school's layout began to tell the story. Miller had intercepted Marcus in the hallway, likely under the pretense of a friendly conversation, and steered him toward the third-floor science wing, a location Miller knew was sealed off from the main student population due to the ongoing asbestos construction. The classroom skeleton, the utility closet, the silence of the construction zone, it all aligned perfectly with a premeditated plan to corner a witness who held the keys to his destruction. The psychological profile of Derek Miller that emerged from the digital data was that of a classic narcissist, a predator who perceived anyone who threatened his social standing as a mortal enemy to be eliminated without hesitation. He wasn't a random thug. He was a cold, calculating strategist who had spent his entire high school career managing his image as a community leader and athletic icon. The detectives realized that Miller had likely assumed that if Marcus vanished, the evidence would disappear with him, and the school's investigation would conclude that the quiet, studious boy had simply run away from home to start a new life. He hadn't accounted for the forensic persistence of the future, nor for the fact that a body hidden behind a wall would eventually be discovered by a generation that had the tools to look back. In the precinct, the atmosphere transitioned from exhausted frustration to a sharp, electric-focused resolve as the detectives began to map out the current life of their suspect. Derek Miller had not disappeared into the criminal underworld. He had done the opposite. He had transitioned from a high school star to a college athlete, then to an MBA graduate, and finally to an educational administrator. He had essentially replicated his high school strategy on a much larger scale, burying his dark secret beneath a resume filled with community service, academic accolades, and the carefully cultivated image of a man dedicated to the success of at-risk youth. The detectives felt a sickening sense of vertigo looking at the professional headshot on his current school's website, seeing the same arrogant, confident smirk that had looked back at them from the 2011 yearbook. The investigative plan became a tactical, high-stakes game of shadows. They couldn't move too quickly, as a man with Miller's resources and status would have an immediate, high-powered legal team ready to shut down any investigation that didn't meet a perfect, beyond reasonable doubt standard of evidence. They needed a direct, physical nexus, a link between his present life and the skeletal remains in the Detroit Wall. The plan centered on the recovery of modern DNA, which meant they needed to gain access to his biological profile without tipping him off, a strategy that would eventually lead them to the quiet, affluent suburbs of Chicago where he now resided. The team began to coordinate with Illinois State Police, establishing a surveillance perimeter that would allow them to follow Miller through his daily routine without his knowledge. As the detectives worked late into the night, the weight of the injustice felt heavier than ever. They were looking at a man who had successfully lived a double life for 13 years, building a family, a career, and a public legacy on the foundation of a murder he had committed when he was 18. The contrast between the brilliant, promising life of Marcus Vance and the cold, calculated survival of Derek Miller served as a brutal, unrelenting motivator for every person in the room. They weren't just solving a cold case anymore. They were engaged in an act of historical correction, a mission to strip away the mask of the man who had traded a boy's future for a scholarship that didn't matter in the grand scheme of his life. The hunt was now officially on, and every lead, every digital trace, and every physical movement of Derek Miller was being tracked by a system that was finally catching up to his long-faded, but never-forgotten, crime. The surveillance operation that spanned the interstate divide from Detroit, Michigan, to the polished, manicured suburbs of Naperville, Illinois, was a masterclass in patient, agonizing restraint. Detective Carver, leading a hand-picked detachment of the cold case squad, had effectively ghosted into the quiet neighborhood where Derek Miller resided, their unmarked black SUVs blending seamlessly into the local fleet of minivans and commuter sedans. The suburb was a picture of Midwestern prosperity: perfectly trimmed hedges, quiet streets where children played under the watchful eyes of security cameras, and a sense of absolute, impenetrable safety that made the reality of Miller's 2011 secret feel like a dark, incongruous hallucination. Carver spent his days in the back of a rental van, his eyes tracking Miller's movements with a clinical, unblinking intensity, watching a man who seemed to be the definition of a respectable citizen, a pillar of his local school district, and a dedicated father of two. Miller's life was a clockwork mechanism of routine. He woke at 5:30 a.m. for a morning run, drove to his administrative office at the high school by 7:15 a.m., attended a series of back-to-back committee meetings, and usually returned home by 6 p.m. for dinner with his wife. He was a man of habits, a man who left nothing to chance, and the detectives soon realized that his obsessive need for order, the same trait that had likely helped him carry out the murder and concealment of Marcus Vance, was now his greatest tactical shield. He didn't frequent bars, he didn't have a side life, and he was remarkably paranoid about his personal space, often shredding his own mail and never leaving personal effects in the offices he occupied. He was a predator who had spent over a decade perfecting the art of invisibility, and the detectives knew that if they made one wrong move, if they showed their cards even a second too early, he would be gone before the first legal document could be filed. The surveillance team was tasked with a singular, high-pressure objective: obtaining a biological sample that could be directly compared to the traces left behind in the lining of Marcus Vance's backpack strap. They had already exhausted the standard legal avenues. Obtaining a search warrant for his DNA without an arrest warrant based on the 2011 link was a legal impossibility, and the prosecution team had explicitly warned Carver that the grade-fixing evidence, while damning for motive, was not enough to trigger a judge's sign-off for a forced blood draw. They were stuck in a precarious, ethically gray zone where they had to rely on the abandoned property loophole, the same loophole that had served as the cornerstone of the case against the Sacramento killer months earlier. They needed Miller to discard something that contained his saliva or skin cells in a way that, by law, constituted a voluntary forfeiture of his privacy. The operation turned into a grueling, daily test of endurance. Carver's partner, a young investigator named Sarah Thorne, was assigned to the trash detail, which required her to monitor the weekly curbside pickup at Miller's residence with a level of vigilance usually reserved for major intelligence operations. The suburban waste disposal schedule was erratic, often disrupted by neighborhood associations and private contractors who collected the bins at different hours on different days. Thorne spent 3 consecutive weeks huddled in the damp, claustrophobic crawlspace of a vacant lot across the street, documenting every single bag that Miller brought out to the curb. She watched him emerge from his garage, walking with that same rigid, disciplined posture, placing his household trash into the designated bins with a sense of deliberate, almost robotic precision that Thorne found increasingly unnerving. The breakthrough, however, did not come from the curb. It came from the local athletic club where Miller pursued his daily exercise routine. Carver received a reliable tip from a member of the club's janitorial staff, a woman who had become suspicious of Miller's obsessive habit of wiping down every piece of gym equipment he touched with his own personal, color-coded towels, a level of sanitary caution that bordered on the pathological. Carver and Thorne, under the cover of gym members, gained entry to the facility and set up an observation post near the locker room showers. They watched as Miller finished his workout, stepped into the private shower stall, and meticulously scrubbed his body before stepping out and discarding a single, used adhesive bandage from a minor finger laceration into a wall-mounted waste bin. It was a golden, 1-in-a-million opportunity. Thorne moved with the speed of an athlete, entering the locker room moments after Miller had exited, using a pair of sterile surgical tweezers to secure the discarded bandage from the bin. The entire interaction took less than 4 seconds, the time it took for a fellow member to walk past the door, but the impact was seismic. She sealed the evidence in a sterilized transport tube, her hands trembling with the adrenaline of the moment, and immediately signaled Carver that the mission was accomplished. They withdrew from the facility with a cold, practiced detachment of professional operatives, leaving no trace of their presence, while Miller, completely oblivious, walked out to his car and drove home to his family, unaware that the final, incontrovertible thread of his past had just been snipped. The forensic analysis was conducted at a high-speed secure laboratory in downtown Chicago, an environment designed for speed and absolute confidentiality. The technicians bypassed the traditional, time-consuming extraction protocols, jumping straight into the high-sensitivity profiling that the department had developed in the wake of the California cold case revolution. For Carver, the next 24 hours were a waking nightmare of uncertainty. He was trapped in a hotel room near the lab, staring at the muted television, waiting for the one call that would either validate his entire career or leave him with nothing but an empty file and a ruined reputation. If the DNA didn't match, he knew that Miller would have the resources to launch a massive, retaliatory lawsuit against the city, effectively destroying the cold case squad and ensuring that Marcus Vance would never have his day in court. When the notification finally buzzed on his encrypted phone at 3:12 a.m., the message was stark and simple. Match confirmed. Probability of random exclusion, 1 in 8 billion. Carver stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the sleeping sprawl of the suburbs, the weight of 13 years of investigation finally beginning to lift. The invisible man had been made visible. The principal, the father, the pillar of the community, had been unmasked as the boy who had choked Marcus Vance to death in a dark, asbestos-choked hallway. The tactical plan was already written in his mind. The warrant would be requested by dawn, the arrest would be executed by the following afternoon, and the long, slow, and agonizing process of dismantling the life Derek Miller had built on the bones of a murdered student would finally commence. The hunt was over, the ghost was caught, and the classroom skeleton was finally going to receive the only thing that mattered now, a definitive, irrevocable sentence of justice. The dawn of June 4, 2026, broke over Naperville, Illinois, with a deceptively peaceful clarity, the sun filtering through the dense canopy of oak trees to illuminate the pristine suburban streets where Derek Miller had spent the last decade constructing a masterpiece of middle-class respectability. Inside the quiet interior of the Miller residence, the atmosphere was thick with a mundane routine that was about to be obliterated. The smell of fresh coffee, the faint hum of a dishwasher, and the soft, sleepy voices of children preparing for school. Derek Miller sat at his kitchen table, reviewing a digital spreadsheet for the upcoming school district budget, his posture relaxed, his expression one of calm, professional focus. He was a man who had mastered the art of compartmentalization, a man who believed that the darkness of his past had been successfully walled off by his achievements, his public image, and the quiet, uninterrupted flow of time. He did not hear the faint, rhythmic thud of dozens of heavy boots on the grass outside, nor did he see the shadows of tactical teams positioning themselves around the perimeter of his home, their weapon-mounted lights turning off and on in a synchronized, lethal dance of precision. The breach was not a chaotic, shouting affair. It was an exercise in absolute, overwhelming force designed to strip away the illusion of sanctuary in a matter of seconds. At precisely 6 a.m., the front door was shattered by a hydraulic ram, the sound echoing through the neighborhood like a sudden, violent crack of thunder. Before the splintered wood had even finished falling to the carpet, a dozen officers were inside, their tactical flashlights cutting through the dim morning light, their voices a singular, ironclad demand for compliance. Miller was pulled from his chair with such speed and force that he didn't even have time to register the presence of the intruders before he was pinned to the floor, his face pressed against the cold, hardwood surface he had so meticulously polished the night before. His wife, frozen in the doorway with a breakfast tray in her hands, began to scream, a shrill, primal sound that cut through the silence of the room. Yet even in the chaos, Miller did not struggle. He went limp, his eyes wide, the realization dawning on him that the invisible net he had felt creeping closer for months had finally snapped shut. Detective Carver stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the harsh, brilliant morning light, his expression a neutral, unyielding mask of professional duty. He stepped over the debris of the door and looked down at the man who had been the architect of Marcus Vance's disappearance, the man who had traded a boy's life for a scholarship and then spent the next 13 years playing the role of a community savior. Miller looked up, his glasses skewed, his breathing rapid and shallow, and for the first time, the arrogance that had defined his demeanor during the surveillance operation evaporated, replaced by a raw, naked terror. Derek Miller. Carver's voice was steady, resonant, and devoid of the triumph he felt deep in his bones. You are under arrest for the murder of Marcus Vance, committed in Detroit, Michigan on January 18, 2011. Your long run of hiding in the light is officially over. The handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists with a metallic, finality-laden sound that resonated in the quiet room, a sound that seemed to signal the instantaneous collapse of the life he had built from the ashes of his first crime. The arrest was conducted with a surgical, high-speed efficiency that ensured Miller was off the suburban block and into a secure, armored transport before the neighborhood could fully comprehend what was unfolding. As the fleet of black SUVs sped away, the suburban tranquility was replaced by a swirling, chaotic sea of confusion, neighbors peeking through their blinds, news helicopters beginning to circle overhead, and the surreal sight of the local principal being hauled away like a common fugitive. Carver rode in the back of the transport, watching Miller through the rearview mirror as he sat on the hard metal bench, his head bowed, his once pristine shirt torn and disheveled. He was no longer the principal, the leader, or the pillar of the community. He was simply a defendant, an accused serial predator whose carefully curated identity had been stripped away by the inescapable, mathematical reality of his own DNA. The transit to the local county jail was done in complete silence, the only sound the muffled drone of the transport's engine and the distant, growing buzz of the media circus that was already descending upon the suburb. Miller did not speak, he did not request an attorney, and he did not look at the passing world outside the window. He stared at the floor, his mind likely racing as he tried to piece together where he had failed, how his perfect, invisible exit had been compromised, and which specific mistake had led the authorities to his front door. It was the irony of the modern age. The man who had meticulously wiped down gym equipment and shredded his own mail had been brought down by a single discarded bandage, a biological remnant that he had dismissed as a trifle, a piece of trash that proved to be his ultimate, unmasking demise. The system had not forgotten, the computers had not stopped running, and the ghost of Marcus Vance had finally reached out from the wall to grab him by the throat. When they arrived at the precinct, the atmosphere was electric, a heavy, buzzing tension that seemed to permeate the concrete walls of the building. Detectives from the Detroit Cold Case Squad were already waiting on the tarmac, having flown in overnight to coordinate the extradition and ensure that the custody chain was handled with absolute, unimpeachable integrity. As Miller was led into the processing room, the flash of cameras from the media gathered behind the police barricades was blinding, a strobe light effect that captured the image of his defeat for the front pages of every newspaper in the country. He was stripped of his belongings, his watch, his wedding ring, and the designer clothing that had signified his status, and handed the coarse, orange uniform of a county inmate. The processing officer moved with a clinical detachment, fingerprints, retinal scans, and DNA swabs all being collected with the same routine efficiency used for a common shoplifter, a stark, humbling reminder that in the eyes of the law, the high-flying principal and the street criminal were exactly the same. In the interrogation room, the temperature was kept at a cool, sterile level, the light above the metal table casting a sharp, unforgiving glow on the suspect's face. Carver walked in, carrying the now familiar evidence folder that contained the digital forensic reconstruction of the 2011 server logs, the damning, irreversible chronicle of the grade-fixing scheme that had provided the primary motive for the murder. He placed the folder on the table, the sound echoing like a gavel, and sat down opposite Miller, who was now sitting with his hands folded, his expression a desperate, flickering attempt to reclaim his composure. "The gig is up, Derek," Carver said, not needing to shout, his voice filled with the quiet, devastating authority of a man who held every card in the deck. "We have the chat logs, we have the server timestamps, and we have the DNA from the bandage that proves you were the one who dragged that boy into the utility closet. You don't have a future as an educator anymore. You have a past as a murderer." Miller looked at the folder, his eyes tracing the edges of the digital documents with a dazed, uncomprehending stare, as if he were seeing the blueprints of his own destruction laid out in black and white. He finally looked up at Carver, his lips trembling, his voice barely audible. "I was a kid," he whispered, the defensive reflex of his youth kicking in, the same excuse he had likely told himself every night for 13 years to justify his survival at the cost of another's existence. "I was just a kid who didn't want to lose my way. I didn't mean for it to go that far." Carver leaned in, his eyes hard and unblinking, his voice a sharp, cutting blade. "You weren't a kid when you walked him into that wall. You weren't a kid when you listened to him clawing at the drywall. And you certainly weren't a kid when you spent the next 13 years lying to your wife, your children, and the thousands of students you taught. You're not a victim of your past, Derek. You're the monster who created it." The truth hung in the air, a physical force that seemed to push Miller back into his chair, the collapse of his 13-year performance complete, the long-delayed, inevitable reckoning finally finding its target in the silence of the room. The arraignment of Derek Miller in the heart of downtown Detroit was not merely a judicial proceeding, it was a societal exorcism of a nightmare that had lingered in the city's subconscious for 13 agonizing years. The courthouse, a grand, imposing edifice of neoclassical stone, was besieged by a sea of humanity that stretched for blocks, a chaotic, emotional gathering of former students, grieving parents, and citizens who had spent their own youths under the shadow of the Cass Tech mystery. The interior of the courtroom was a pressure cooker of tension, the air thick with the scent of damp wool and the collective, anxious breathing of a room packed to its rafters. When Miller was finally ushered into the chamber, the heavy iron chains rattling against his orange jumpsuit with every slow, deliberate step, a wave of profound, suffocating silence fell over the gallery. He looked older, his face gaunt, the carefully crafted mask of the respected educator having completely disintegrated, revealing a man who now wore the hollow, brittle expression of someone realizing that the world he had manipulated for a decade had finally turned its back on him. The presiding judge, a woman whose career was defined by her no-nonsense, iron-willed dedication to the law, presided over the session with a somber, detached authority. As the prosecutor stood to deliver the formal charges, the narrative of that tragic January afternoon in 2011 was laid bare in a cold, clinical, and devastatingly precise sequence of events. The courtroom felt as if it were holding its breath as the prosecution detailed the motive, a fragile, insecure ego built upon a scaffolding of academic fraud, and the method, a brutal, manual act of violence carried out in the dark, restricted confines of a construction zone. The prosecutor's voice was the only sound in the room, cutting through the stillness like a surgeon's blade, describing how Miller had lured Marcus Vance under the guise of an apology, how he had utilized the isolation of the asbestos-ridden third floor to ensure no one would hear the struggle, and how he had spent those final, chilling minutes ensuring that the boy who held his secret would never breathe again. For Miller, sitting at the defense table, the hearing was a slow-motion destruction of his existence. He was forced to listen to the testimony of a forensic expert who described the skeletal remains, the position of the body in the utility closet, and the physical evidence of the boy's frantic, desperate struggle as his life was being taken. The prosecution then introduced the digital evidence, the server logs, the chat transcripts, and the incriminating timestamps that proved the grade-fixing scheme was not a youthful indiscretion, but a calculated criminal enterprise that Miller had been prepared to kill for. The gallery watched with unblinking intensity as the prosecutor held up a printout of a private message Miller had sent to one of his accomplices 3 hours after Marcus vanished. "Everything is taken care of. The problem is gone." The simple, callous text shattered whatever lingering illusions remained about the defendant's character, transforming the man who had been a high school principal into a figure of pure, chilling remorselessness. The defense attorney, a seasoned, high-priced specialist brought in from out of state, attempted to frame the murder as a momentary, panicked reaction of a boy who felt his entire future collapsing under the threat of exposure. He argued that Miller's subsequent life, his academic achievements, his work with underprivileged youth, and his stable family life was evidence of a man who had been profoundly changed, a man who had sought redemption through a decade of selfless service. But the argument fell flat, dying in the stale, heavy air of the courtroom. The judge leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Miller, and spoke with a quiet, icy clarity that made it clear no redemption story could offset the deliberate, systematic nature of the crime. The defense's appeal for medical bail was denied within minutes, the judge citing the severity of the offense and the clear, documented evidence of a decade-long cover-up that had only been interrupted by the fortuitous discovery of the remains. As the session drew to a close, Miller was granted the right to make a statement, a moment that the gallery had been waiting for with a mix of dread and morbid curiosity. He stood up, his chains clinking, his voice trembling as he began to speak of his regret, his deep, enduring sorrow for the pain he had caused, and his desperate hope for forgiveness. But it was a performance that failed to land, a hollow echo of the sincerity he had practiced in his own living room for years. He spoke of his own future, of his children, and of the tragedy of his own life being derailed, revealing the core of his narcissism even in the shadow of the gallows. The gallery reacted with a low, collective groan of disgust, the sound of a community recognizing the same manipulative predator who had walked through the halls of Cul-De-Sac with such chilling indifference 13 years earlier. The order to remand Miller to maximum security custody was the definitive end of the principal, the educator, and the neighbor. As the bailiffs moved to lead him away, Miller looked back toward the gallery, catching the eye of a woman in the second row, Marcus Vance's mother. For a brief, haunting second, the two of them held each other's gaze, a moment of profound, painful connection where all the history of the case seemed to condense. The mother's expression was not one of rage, but of a hollow, unbreakable sadness, the look of a person who had finally reached the end of a long, dark road and found that the destination offered no relief from the burden of her loss. Miller, for the first time in his life, seemed to be truly and completely broken, his eyes darting away from hers as the bailiffs forced him toward the side exit, his body sagging under the weight of the handcuffs and the realization that his performance had finally reached its final curtain. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere in the cold case squad office was a mixture of relief and professional, lingering exhaustion. Detective Carver sat at his desk, the original 2011 file open before him, the pages covered in handwritten notes, timestamps, and evidence tags that had been his constant companions for years. He watched the news coverage on a muted monitor in the corner, seeing the images of Miller being escorted into the detention center, and he felt a strange, quiet emptiness. The hunt was done, the evidence was ironclad, and the path to a conviction was as clear as it could ever be, yet the tragedy itself remained an unshakable, immovable object in his mind. He pulled a fresh, clean sheet of paper from his drawer, wrote Marcus Vance, final disposition at the top, and began to draft the final summary that would be added to the state archive. The resolution of the case sent ripples through the educational administration system nationwide, forcing a complete overhaul of how student data was protected and how suspicious disappearances were handled by school district boards. Independent commissions were formed to review the chaotic, budget-cut-ridden era of the early 2010s, ensuring that the structural vulnerabilities Miller had exploited, the hidden hallways, the unmonitored maintenance zones, the lack of centralized digital oversight, would never be allowed to exist again. The Cul-De-Sac disappearance became the gold standard for what can happen when institutional secrecy is prioritized over the safety of the individual, a cautionary tale that would be studied by school administrators for decades to come. As the evening wore on, the city of Detroit began to shift back into its nightly rhythm, the sirens in the distance and the low, steady hum of traffic outside providing a backdrop to the quiet finality of the day. The case of the classroom skeleton was no longer an unsolved, haunting mystery. It was a resolved, documented act of human cruelty that had been forced into the light by the persistence of technology and the unyielding determination of a few investigators who refused to let the boy in the wall be forgotten. In his small, private office, Carver sat back in his chair, the silence of the room a testament to the closure that had finally arrived, a closure that did not bring happiness, but at least offered the cold, clean comfort of the truth finally having the last word. The trial of Derek Miller was a descent into the darkest chambers of the human psyche, a protracted, soul-crushing examination of how a brilliant, calculating mind can compartmentalize a singular act of atrocity while building a life of public virtue atop its foundation. The courtroom itself felt transformed, the very air inside the wood-paneled walls seemingly weighted by the presence of a ghost that had haunted the community for 13 years. The prosecution, spearheaded by a team that had meticulously mapped every byte of digital evidence and every microscopic thread of physical proof, didn't just aim to secure a conviction. They aimed to dismantle the entire, carefully constructed mythology of Derek Miller the educator. Witness after witness took the stand. Former students who recalled the atmosphere of suspicion and fear on the day Marcus vanished, forensic experts who articulated the agonizing physics of the struggle in the utility closet, and, most devastatingly, the school IT administrators who exposed the sheer, cold-blooded technical audacity of Miller's grade-fixing enterprise. The defense, led by a lawyer known for his theatrical, often aggressive tactics, attempted to weave a narrative of temporary, adolescent insanity, arguing that Miller, then only 18, had been thrust into a high-pressure environment where his entire future felt like it was crumbling. They painted a picture of a scared, desperate teenager who acted in a moment of reactive panic, a story they hoped would resonate with a jury potentially sympathetic to the volatility of youth. But every time the defense leaned into this narrative, the prosecution responded with a rhythmic, devastating counterpunch. They introduced the archived chat logs, the calculated steps taken to secure the asbestos-ridden construction site, and the chilling, matter-of-fact messaging to his co-conspirators immediately after the act. It wasn't the work of a panicked child. It was the precision work of a cold, tactical strategist who viewed his peers as obstacles to be removed from his path to glory. The most visceral moment of the proceedings arrived when Marcus Vance's mother was called to the stand. The room fell into such a profound state of stillness that the frantic ticking of the courtroom clock became the only audible sound. She did not scream. She did not hurl accusations. She spoke in a soft, steady, and terrifyingly clear voice about the 13 years she had spent walking through the front door of her home expecting to see her son's shoes by the radiator, only to find the same cold silence that greeted her every evening since 2011. She addressed Miller directly, her gaze fixed on him with a depth of sorrow that seemed to drain the color from his face. She spoke of the 13 years he had stolen, the graduations, the birthdays, the simple, mundane milestones of a life he had extinguished to save his own scholarship. Miller, who had sat through the technical evidence with a practiced, stoic detachment, finally broke. He slumped forward, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the realization that he was no longer an educator defending his reputation. He was the man who had stolen the world from a woman who wanted nothing more than to see her son grow old. As the evidentiary phase concluded and the jury retreated to deliberate, the city of Detroit seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the courthouse steps were crowded with a somber, expectant throng, many of them wearing navy blue school cardigans as a silent, heartbreaking tribute to the memory of the boy in the wall. Inside the detention holding area, the reality of his impending fate finally anchored itself in Miller's mind. He had spent his adult life curating an image of inevitable success, believing he could outrun the shadow of his high school self forever, but the mathematics of the modern age had proven him wrong. He had left a trail that couldn't be scrubbed, a footprint that couldn't be erased, and a witness in the wall that could not be silenced. The detectives who had hunted him sat in the gallery, watching the jury room door, their faces marked by a quiet, exhaustion-laden satisfaction, knowing that the case which had claimed so much of their lives was now finally slipping out of their control and into the hands of justice. When the foreperson finally emerged from the deliberation room, His expression was tight and unreadable, an island of calm in the swirling, high-stakes storm of the courtroom. The verdict was read with a clinical, unvarnished efficiency, guilty on all counts, including first-degree premeditated murder and obstruction of justice. The reaction in the gallery was not one of jubilation, but of a collective, released sigh, as if a long-held, painful truth had finally been allowed to settle into its proper place. Miller didn't look up as the verdict was delivered. He remained motionless, a man who had built a skyscraper of a life on the foundation of a grain of sand, watching as the entire structure finally buckled and collapsed under the weight of the truth. He was remanded to custody immediately, his life as a free man, a husband, a father, and a school administrator having ended in the cold, unyielding language of the legal system. The sentence handed down days later, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, was the final, closing punctuation in the saga of the classroom skeleton. As Miller was led away for the final time, his path to the detention center took him past the very streets he had walked as a child, the city he had tried to outrun, and the memory of the academy that he had turned into a tomb. He was no longer the principal. He was merely an inmate, a face in a line of others, his legacy reduced to a warning about the fragility of human secrets. The trial, with its agonizingly detailed exploration of his motive and his method, had stripped him of every defense, leaving him with only the cold, unalterable reality of his crime and the 13 years he had spent pretending it had never happened. The city of Detroit, which had been scarred by the mystery for so long, finally began the slow, arduous process of moving forward, the memory of Marcus Vance now etched into its history not as a missing, vanished child, but as the boy whose persistence ultimately brought the truth to light. In the final hours of the day, Detective Carver walked to the storage facility where the Cast Tech archives were held, the heavy iron door of the locker room closing behind him. He took the original, water-damaged folder he had pulled from the basement back in 2026, the folder that contained the very first inkling of the digital evidence trail, and placed it onto the shelf labeled Final Disposition. The case was closed, the records were processed, and the truth had been settled in a court of law. Yet, as he walked back out into the cool, darkening evening, he could not help but think of the thousands of other young people who had walked those same halls, their lives unfolding in the wake of a tragedy they never even knew existed. The classroom skeleton had been a grim, devastating accident of history, but the resolution was an act of pure, human persistence, a testament to the fact that even in a city of ruins, the light of the truth can eventually find its way through the darkest, most carefully sealed walls. The phantom was caught, the boy was remembered, and the long, cold winter of 2011 had finally, definitively, come to an end. The aftermath of the trial did not bring the silence that Derek Miller had so desperately sought for over a decade. Instead, it ushered in a period of intense, public introspection that rippled through the American education system and the forensic community alike. As Miller was processed into the general population of a maximum security state penitentiary, his transition from the principal of the year to inmate 9284 was absolute and brutal. The life he had curated, a life built on the strategic erasure of his own history, had been replaced by the rigid, institutional clock of the prison. In the quiet hours of his first week, he was forced to reconcile with the reality that his status, his intellect, and his ability to manipulate social environments were now effectively useless. He was no longer a puppet master. He was a relic, a man who had gambled his entire existence on the assumption that the past would stay dead, only to be undone by the very digital breadcrumbs he had left behind in his hubris. Back in Detroit, the cold case squad was not afforded the luxury of a victory lap. The ripple effects of the conviction meant that every unsolved disappearance linked to institutional settings, schools, hospitals, orphanages, was being scrutinized under a new, high-powered lens. Detective Carver found himself inundated with requests from agencies across the state, all seeking the same forensic and computational blueprint that had finally unmasked Miller. The methodology was being codified into a national standard, a cold case protocol, that prioritized the recovery of legacy digital artifacts, servers, disk drives, and internal school networks that had long been considered junk data. The skeleton in the third-floor classroom had become a catalyst for a nationwide audit of historical institutional crimes, a movement to peel back the drywall of the past and confront the secrets that had been hidden by a generation of administrators who prioritized reputation over the sanctity of human life. The psychological impact on the former students of Cass Tech was profound and, in many cases, permanent. A support group formed almost immediately, a virtual and physical space where those who had walked the halls with Marcus and Derek could navigate the trauma of their shared history. For many, the trial acted as a lens, forcing them to reevaluate their own memories of 2011, the way Miller had played the role of the charismatic leader, the way the school administration had ignored the red flags of Marcus's disappearance, and the way they had all been forced to exist in a reality that was being manipulated right under their noses. They organized memorial scholarships in Marcus's name, ensuring that his legacy would not be defined by the dark utility closet where he spent his final moments, but by the intellectual potential and academic promise he represented. The school itself, now a community park, hosted a small, permanent stone monument, a quiet place of reflection that served as a physical boundary between the city's past and its future. For Detective Carver, the conclusion of the case brought about a strange, existential shift in his own career. Having spent years chasing the phantom of Marcus Vance, he found that the transition back to normal police work felt disjointed. He began to dedicate his time to training the next generation of detectives, focusing specifically on the marriage between investigative intuition and big data forensic analysis. He taught them that the most important evidence in a cold case wasn't always a fingerprint or a blood stain. It was the digital residue, the metadata, the server logs, and the reconstructed communications that revealed the human intent behind the act. He emphasized that every criminal, no matter how meticulous or how protected by their status, leaves behind an invisible wake, a ripple in the digital landscape that can be traced if one has the patience to keep looking. In the prison, Miller's existence took on a new, grim dimension. He had become an object of intense curiosity and occasionally open hostility from other inmates who viewed his crimes, the murder of a high school student to protect a fake grade, with a level of disdain that surprised the prison staff. He withdrew into himself, spending hours in the prison library reading not educational theories or motivational books, but the growing mountain of court transcripts and journalistic postmortems about his own trial. He was a man obsessed with his own narrative, still trying to find a way to justify the act, to re-engineer the story in his mind so that he could emerge as a sympathetic, tragic figure. But the walls of the penitentiary were relentless. They provided no audience for his performance, no institutional ladder for him to climb, and no digital portal for him to manipulate. He was effectively forced to face the silence he had once inflicted upon Marcus, a silence that he now had to carry with him for the rest of his life. The journalistic interest in the case, fueled by the staggering details of the digital forensic breakthrough, led to a cascade of investigative long-form pieces that explored the broader implications of the Cass Tech mystery. Major publications dissected the culture of academic competition that had existed in 2011, noting how the pressure to succeed had created an environment where students were willing to commit or cover up atrocious crimes to protect their futures. The Miller case became the definitive case study in the intersection of teenage narcissism and institutional failures. Educators across the country began to implement ethics training that focused specifically on the consequences of grade fixing and academic integrity, treating Miller's rise and fall as a cautionary parable about the corrosive nature of unchecked ambition. As the months passed, the city of Detroit continued its slow, painstaking process of urban revitalization. The park where the school once stood became a hub of community activity, a place for children to play, for residents to walk, and for the neighborhood to reclaim the ground that had been stained by such a senseless act of violence. The memory of Marcus Vance was slowly woven into the fabric of the city's story, not as a forgotten, vanished boy, but as the spark that forced the system to confront its own ghosts. The detective squad that had once been dismissed as a department of dreamers chasing dead-end files was now the premier unit in the state, a testament to the fact that with enough tenacity and the right technological tools, even the deepest, most carefully hidden graves can be uncovered. In his final months of the year, Carver found himself walking through the community park on a crisp October afternoon. The trees were turning a vibrant gold, and the sound of children playing in the distance provided a sharp, life-affirming contrast to the sterile, gray environment of the interrogation rooms he had spent so much time in. He walked to the memorial stone, running his hand over the smooth, polished surface where Marcus's name was etched. There was no sense of closure, not in the way the movies portrayed it. No happy ending, no sudden removal of the grief that had defined the last decade of so many people's lives. Instead, there was a sense of alignment. The truth had been acknowledged, the perpetrator was contained, and the story had been told in full. The long, agonizing winter of 2011 had finally, definitively yielded to the slow, steady progress of a spring that had taken 13 years to arrive. Carver stood there for a long time, watching the sun set behind the skyline, feeling the quiet, heavy peace of a job done, a mission accomplished in the name of a boy who would have been 32 years old, a man who would have been an engineer, and a student whose ghost had finally been allowed to leave the wall. The legacy of the Derek Miller case crystallized into something far more significant than a mere legal precedent or a viral true crime phenomenon. It became a permanent scar and a source of profound institutional change within the American educational landscape. As the summer of 2026 reached its peak, the echoes of the trial continued to reverberate through the halls of every school district from the Midwest to the coastal cities. Educational boards, once reactive and notoriously protective of their internal reputations, began an era of radical, aggressive transparency. The Miller Protocol, a set of mandates requiring the immediate, third-party audit of any suspicious disappearance or unexplained administrative anomaly, was signed into law in 12 states, effectively ending the era where schools could operate as autonomous fiefdoms shielded from the oversight of law enforcement. Inside the penitentiary, Derek Miller's existence had become a study in radical, enforced insignificance. The man who had been a master of public perception, the principal who had commanded rooms with the flick of a wrist and the weight of a title, was now reduced to a series of numbers and cell checks. The prison administration, acutely aware of his notoriety and the risk he posed to the stability of the general population, had moved him into a specialized, high-security housing unit where his interaction with other inmates was strictly controlled. In this environment, the performance that had sustained his 13-year masquerade had no audience. There were no boards to impress, no parents to charm, and no students to mold. There was only the cold, unyielding silence of the concrete walls and the unrelenting presence of his own thoughts. The detectives who had dismantled his life, Carver and Thorne, remained the primary architects of a new, nationwide task force dedicated to the archival resurrection of cold cases. They were no longer just chasing suspects. They were chasing data. They had realized that the most powerful weapon in the modern investigator's arsenal was not the gun or the badge, but the ability to synthesize the forgotten, fragmented digital noise of the past into a coherent, undeniable narrative. Their success with the CAS tech server files had opened a floodgate, leading to the resolution of dozens of long-dormant cases where the physical evidence had been considered compromised or non-probative by the standards of a decade prior. They had proven that the digital afterlife of a crime, the logs, the metadata, the emails, could serve as a surrogate witness when the biological evidence had been degraded by time. Public interest in the case eventually shifted from the sensation of the trial to a deeper, more philosophical inquiry into the nature of human evil and the fragility of societal trust. Documentarians and investigative journalists began to publish exhaustive, multi-part series that examined the Miller paradox, how a person could function as a force for good in their local community while harboring the memory of a cold-blooded murder. The consensus among psychologists who studied the case was that Miller had successfully bifurcated his identity, viewing his administrative persona as an entirely separate entity from the boy who had killed Marcus Vance. This psychological splitting, while successful for 13 years, had ultimately proved to be a house of cards that could not withstand the structural integrity of the truth. His downfall was not just a failure of his planning, but a failure of his own psyche, which had eventually betrayed him through the same obsessive, perfectionist habits that had allowed him to commit the crime in the first place. For the community of Detroit, the resolution of the case served as a strange, bittersweet turning point in the city's broader narrative of decay and resurgence. The site of the old Cul-De-Sac Academy, now a vibrant community park, became a pilgrimage site of sorts, not for the macabre, but for the hopeful. On the anniversary of Marcus Vance's disappearance, the park would be filled with families, local leaders, and students who had never known the academy, all coming together to participate in the Vance Day of Service, a day dedicated to youth mentorship and academic integrity. It was a transformation of tragedy into purpose, a way for the city to acknowledge the blood that had been spilled on that ground without letting it define the future of the neighborhood. The ghost in the wall had been exorcised, not by forgetting, but by actively choosing to replace the silence of 2011 with a culture of radical, community-wide accountability. In the late months of 2026, Carver found himself reflecting on the evolution of his own role within the department. He had been a man who once believed that police work was entirely defined by the physical confrontation, the stakeout, the interrogation, the physical arrest. The Cul-De-Sac case had fundamentally altered his worldview, demonstrating that the future of justice was, in fact, an act of intellectual labor. He spent his days mentoring young, tech-savvy recruits, showing them how to read the digital breadcrumbs that every human being leaves behind in their transit through the world. He taught them that every secret, no matter how carefully guarded, leaves a footprint in the data, and that with enough persistence, the wall can always be breached. He was no longer just a detective. He was a gatekeeper of the truth, a man who had seen the absolute limit of what one person can hide from the world. As the year drew to a close, the final report for the Marcus Vance file was archived in the state's digital repository, a multi-terabyte collection of evidence, transcripts, and analysis that stood as a permanent, searchable record of the case. Anyone from any corner of the globe could eventually access the story of how a boy was lost, how he was silenced, and how the architecture of his own school had been transformed into his final resting place. The anonymity that Miller had craved had been permanently stripped away, replaced by the relentless, searchable clarity of history. The case had served as the ultimate test of the system's ability to rectify its own historical failures, and in the end, it had proven that the system could only work if there were individuals willing to look into the darkness and keep looking long after everyone else had turned away. The city settled into the quiet, heavy snow of a Michigan winter. The park gates closed for the season, the monument to Marcus standing tall and silent against the white, drifting landscape. The case was no longer a headline. It was a settled matter of history, a resolved equation, and a completed chapter in the long, arduous journey of a city that had faced its worst impulses and emerged with a deeper, more resilient understanding of what it meant to protect its own. For the detectives, the families, and the community that had carried the weight of the mystery, there was no celebration, only the quiet, profound relief of knowing that the burden had been put down at last. The boy in the wall was no longer alone. The truth had been spoken, and the winter of 2011 had finally, definitively, dissolved into the past. The final months of 2026 brought a strange, settling quiet to the city of Detroit, a sense of closure that felt as heavy and permanent as the freshly poured concrete in the new community park where Cul-De-Sac Academy once stood. The trial of Derek Miller had been the final, loud exclamation point in a saga that had begun with a silent scream in a third-floor utility closet, and now, as the legal dust settled, the focus of the city shifted toward the profound, structural questions raised by the case. The institutional damage that had allowed Miller to operate, the systemic neglect, the reliance on paper records that were easily manipulated, the culture of silence regarding grade inflation and athletic favoritism, was being systematically dismantled. Every high school across the state of Michigan was now required to adhere to the Vance-Miller Transparency Standards, a set of digital-first record-keeping protocols that made the kind of backdoor manipulation Miller had utilized an impossibility in the modern age. Inside the detention center, Derek Miller had settled into a rhythm of total, crushing anonymity, a state of being that was the antithesis of the public persona he had spent his entire life crafting. His lawyers had exhausted their primary appeals, and the state had denied every petition for a transfer to a less restrictive facility, citing the high-profile nature of his crimes and the security risks posed by his notoriety. Miller lived in a 9-by-10 cell, his days dictated by the rigid, unchanging routine of the penitentiary. He had become a ghost in his own life, a man whose existence was marked only by the count of the guards and the occasional, infrequent notification of a legal update. There were no more students to inspire, no more committees to influence, and no more secrets to guard. The walls of his life had been reduced to the cold, gray concrete of his confinement, a mirror reflecting the same claustrophobic, silent space he had forced Marcus Vance to occupy 13 years earlier. The narrative of the Cul-De-Sac mystery began to evolve in the public consciousness, shifting from a tragic true crime story into a broader, cultural meditation on the cost of the American dream when it is divorced from moral accountability. Universities across the nation held seminars on the Miller case, dissecting the intersection of teenage narcissism, athletic pressure, and institutional rot. The case became a foundational text for a new generation of criminal justice students, an example of how a singular, overlooked act of violence can ripple outward for over a decade, consuming the lives of not just the victim, but the killer and the entire community that bore witness to the deception. It was a sobering reminder that the perfect crime is often just a temporary state, a fragile illusion maintained only until the advancement of technology or the sheer, persistent will of a dedicated investigator forces the truth to the surface. Detective Carver, now serving as the state's lead consultant on institutional cold cases, found himself traveling extensively, bringing the lessons of the Cul-De-Sac investigation to law enforcement departments from New York to California. He was no longer just a homicide detective. He was a bridge between the analog past and the digital future. He spoke to packed auditoriums of junior officers, detailing the importance of preserving even the most seemingly irrelevant data, the power of reconstructed server logs, and the necessity of looking at cold cases with the assumption that the truth is still hiding in the metadata. He didn't focus on the horror of Miller's actions, but on the intellectual victory of the investigation, on the way a community of analysts, tech forensic experts, and detectives had come together to piece together a reality that had been intentionally shredded and buried. As winter began to wrap the city of Detroit in its familiar, biting chill, the physical monument to Marcus Vance in the park saw a constant, quiet stream of visitors. It wasn't just the family or the former classmates. It was everyday citizens who had been moved by the story of the boy in the wall, people who saw in Marcus a symbol of the forgotten, the silenced, and the innocent. The monument, a simple, elegant sculpture of polished stone, featured an engraving of the city championship medal that had been found near his bones. It was a subtle, poignant reminder that Marcus had been more than just a victim. He was a talented, promising individual whose life had been measured by his intellect and his achievements long before he became the center of a national tragedy. The park had become a place of healing, a transformation of a site of trauma into a space for reflection and collective remembrance. The broader investigative efforts of Carver's team continued to bear fruit, with 3 other long-unsolved cases in the Detroit area showing signs of progress due to the application of the same digital forensic techniques that had trapped Miller. The Cul-De-Sac effect was rippling outward, creating a climate where criminals who had felt secure for decades were suddenly forced to reckon with the reality that their pasts were no longer static. The technology that had unmasked Miller was being applied to old DNA samples, discarded property, and forgotten communication archives, creating a new, pervasive sense of vulnerability for anyone who had committed a crime in the era before widespread digital surveillance. The case had served as a warning. The shadows are no longer safe, and the passage of time is no longer a guaranteed exit strategy. In the final days of 2026, Carver returned to the storage facility to officially sign off on the last of the paperwork for the Vance file. He moved slowly through the aisles of the warehouse, his boots clicking on the concrete, the silence of the facility now feeling less like a place where secrets were buried and more like a cathedral of resolved history. He found the shelf where the original evidence box had sat, now empty and clean, the files having been moved to the permanent, restricted state archive. There was a sense of profound, heavy satisfaction in knowing that the job was finished, that the boy who had been missing for 13 years had finally been found, and that the man who had stolen his life would never know the warmth of the sun again. As he walked out of the warehouse and into the cooling evening, Carver looked up at the Detroit skyline, which was slowly, steadily being rebuilt. The city was changing, the old scars were being covered, and the new architecture of the city was more transparent, more interconnected, and more resilient than it had ever been. He felt a deep, quiet gratitude for the persistence of the truth, for the way that justice, though often delayed by the inefficiencies of human nature and the limitations of technology, remains an inevitable gravity. He knew that there would always be secrets, always be people who would try to build their lives on the graves of others, and always be cases that seemed impossible to solve. But after the Cul-De-Sac investigation, he also knew that the truth is never truly gone. It is only waiting for someone with the patience, the tools, and the refusal to look away to bring it back into the light. He climbed into his car, the engine turning over with a steady, reliable hum, and drove home, leaving the shadows of the past behind, content in the knowledge that for Marcus Vance, and for the city that had grieved him, the story had finally, and correctly, reached its end. The final chapter of the Cul-De-Sac investigation was not written in a courtroom or a forensic laboratory, but in the quiet, lingering aftermath of a community finally learning how to breathe again. As the spring of 2027 bloomed across Detroit, the city entered a period of transition that felt less like a recovery and more like a rebirth. The Vance Miller case had become a cultural touchstone, a permanent fixture in the civic consciousness that served as a recurring reminder of the necessity of vigilance. For the investigators of the Cold Case Squad, the victory was never about the triumph of the law, but about the restoration of the victim's identity, a young man whose life had been systematically erased by a predator who had effectively weaponized the institutional failures of the early 2010s. The investigation, which had spanned over a decade, concluded with a quiet, solemn finality that resonated through the corridors of the precinct and the homes of every family that had waited for an answer for 13 years. Inside the penitentiary, Derek Miller's life had become an exercise in radical, enforced invisibility. The media circus, the public discourse, and the intense scrutiny of his case had eventually subsided into a distant hum, leaving him alone with the inescapable architecture of his own reality. He had been transferred to a high-security isolation unit, a move necessitated by both the threat posed to him by other inmates and the procedural requirements of his sentence. In this environment, his ability to manage his environment, the very skill set that had once made him a successful school principal, was rendered entirely moot. He spent his days in the silence of his unit, a man who had sacrificed his humanity to protect a fraudulent GPA, only to realize, far too late, that the reputation he had killed for was the first thing to be destroyed by the truth. His story became a cautionary tale whispered among the prisoners, a reminder that the world outside the fence had evolved to a point where secrets no longer had a shelf life. The legal and administrative infrastructure of the city of Detroit underwent a transformative overhaul in the wake of the conviction. The school district, once mired in the chaotic aftermath of budget crises and privatization, emerged as a model of digital accountability. Every record, academic, disciplinary, and maintenance, was now managed through a decentralized, encrypted ledger system that made historical tampering an impossibility. The Vance Miller case was integrated into the training curriculum for all new teachers and administrators, a mandatory course on ethics, institutional responsibility, and the warning signs of narcissistic predation. The city had collectively decided that the best way to honor Marcus Vance was to ensure that no student would ever again be invisible, that no classroom wing would ever be left unmonitored, and that the safety of a child would never be sacrificed for the vanity of an adult. Detective Carver, having effectively closed the book on the most demanding investigation of his life, found himself in a position of quiet, reflective transition. He had transitioned away from the high-stakes, adrenaline-fueled environment of the Cold Case Squad to serve as an advisor for the newly formed Integrity Commission. His work now focused on the preventative side of justice, identifying the institutional gaps that allowed for the concealment of crimes, and helping school districts develop the kind of forensic-ready documentation that had eventually unmasked Miller. He spent his mornings walking through the city, often ending his day at the community park that replaced the old academy. He watched the students from the new school nearby as they played, noting that the culture of the institution was palpably different, grounded in a sense of open communication and mutual accountability that had been absent in 2011. The mother of Marcus Vance, who had carried the physical weight of her son's disappearance for over a decade, had eventually found a fragile, tempered peace. She was no longer defined by the question of where or who, but by the legacy of why. She established the Marcus Vance Educational Foundation, which provided technology scholarships to underprivileged students in the city, focusing specifically on those who showed the same aptitude for computer science that Marcus had possessed. The foundation became a thriving, vital institution, a living, breathing testament to the brilliance that had been stifled in that utility closet. Every year, at the scholarship banquet, she stood before a room of bright-eyed students and spoke not of the tragedy, but of the potential for truth, for innovation, and for the unwavering courage to protect one another from the darkness that she had faced. As the years began to blur into the history of the city, the Cul-De-Sac skeleton stopped being a sensationalized title and started to be viewed as a milestone in the progress of criminal justice. It was a case that had marked the end of an era of analog shadows and institutional secrecy, and the beginning of a new one, defined by the power of metadata, the persistence of digital records, and the refusal of a community to let a missing boy become a forgotten statistic. The detectives of the Detroit Cold Case Squad were no longer looked at as individuals working in isolation, but as the vanguard of a global movement in forensic science. Their work had provided a blueprint for how to bridge the divide between the past and the present, demonstrating that the passage of time is no longer a viable escape for those who commit acts of hidden malice. In the final days of his tenure at the Integrity Commission, Carver revisited the state archives one last time to look at the digital files associated with the case. He pulled up the final, processed record, the high-resolution image of the recovered track metal, the clean, reconstructed server logs that had pointed to the office, and the conclusive DNA report from the Chicago gym. The file was a masterpiece of investigative labor, a tapestry woven from thousands of individual digital threads. He closed the browser, the screen going black. The information finally settled into its permanent, static place in the state's historical record. The truth was secure. It was archived, searchable, and fundamentally unchangeable. There were no more mysteries to solve regarding Marcus Vance, no more secrets to be revealed, and no more questions left to be answered. The city of Detroit, once defined by its decline, had transformed into a place where the infrastructure was as robust as the community's demand for the truth. The skyline, reflecting the late afternoon sun, shimmered with the promise of a future that had finally reconciled with its past. Carver left the office and walked out onto the street, the air carrying the crisp, sharp promise of a new season. He had spent his career hunting ghosts, and in the case of Marcus Vance, he had found that the ghost was not a supernatural entity, but a reality that had simply been waiting for the right moment to emerge. He climbed into his car, the city humming with the purposeful, steady energy of a place that knew exactly where it stood. The hunt was over, the mystery was extinguished, and the boy who had been trapped in the wall for 13 winters was finally, at long last, free to live in the memory of a city that would never, under any circumstances, let him go. The final chapter of the Detroit Chronicle was not written in the cold, clinical language of the courtroom, nor in the sterile reports of the state archives, but in the slow, rhythmic pulse of a city that had finally learned to confront its own ghosts. As the summer of 2026 reached its zenith, the site of the former Cul-De-Sac Academy, the ground where the classroom skeleton had been unearthed, had been fully integrated into the fabric of the neighborhood as a beacon of transparency and collective healing. The park was no longer just a patch of green grass in an industrial district. It had become the epicenter of a citywide movement to ensure that the systemic rot which had allowed Derek Miller to exist was permanently excised from the institutional consciousness. The Miller case, once a sensational headline that had gripped the nation in a visceral, terrifying fear, had matured into a permanent, sobering lesson on the intersection of human ego, digital surveillance, and the relentless, creeping inevitability of historical accountability. Inside the sprawling, high-security complex of the state penitentiary, Derek Miller lived in a state of suspended animation, his existence defined by the absolute, grinding monotony of his incarceration. He had been stripped of his title, his influence, and the very identity he had so carefully curated. His life was now reduced to a series of gray, identical days, devoid of the intellectual stimulation he had once utilized to orchestrate his deceptive brilliance. The man who had once maneuvered the halls of power and influenced the lives of thousands of students was now a non-entity, a prisoner whose legacy had been surgically rewritten to exclude his achievements and permanently associate his name with the suffocating silence of a utility closet. In the prison's law library, where he was permitted limited time, Miller often found himself searching for his own name in the digital archives, reading the thousands of pages of court transcripts, investigative summaries, and investigative journalism that documented the collapse of his 13-year performance. He was a man who lived in the ruins of his own choosing, forced to witness the world move on, improve, and heal, all while he remained frozen in the moment of his own moral expiration. The investigative machinery that had brought him down, however, was in the midst of a global renaissance. Detective Carver, no longer bound to the cold case squad, had become the primary architect of the Historical Digital Integrity Initiative, a government-funded project dedicated to applying the same algorithmic forensic techniques that had broken the Cul-De-Sac case to thousands of other cold cases across the country. The initiative focused on the legacy data problem, the millions of gigabytes of information trapped in obsolete server architectures, corrupted disk drives, and siloed administrative systems that had previously been considered inaccessible or irrelevant to law enforcement. Carver and his team had effectively turned the concept of a cold case on its head, proving that a crime, no matter how old, carries with it an invisible, enduring digital footprint that can be reconstructed with enough patience, computing power, and the refusal to believe that anything is truly lost. The forensic community watched as the success of the Detroit investigation became the cornerstone of a new field, digital archaeology in criminal investigation. Academic departments and private labs raced to refine the extraction protocols that Thorne and Carver had pioneered in the Chicago gym, developing high-sensitivity sequencing machines capable of pulling biological blueprints from material that had been discarded decades earlier. The boundary between the past and the present had effectively dissolved. Where once a murder in 2011 would have been considered solved by accident or forgotten by necessity, the Miller precedent established that a case remains active as long as the digital data survives. The Cul-De-Sac mystery was the tip of the spear in a forensic revolution that had fundamentally shifted the power dynamic between the criminal and the state, making the act of concealment a logistical impossibility in an era where every action leaves a trail that can eventually be read. For the community of former Cul-De-Sac students, the finality of the resolution had allowed for a profound, albeit painful, integration of the tragedy into their own adult lives. The support groups and memorial foundations had evolved into advocacy hubs, lobbying for increased funding for youth mental health and early intervention programs in urban school districts. They had transformed the narrative of Marcus Vance from a victim of a monstrous act into a symbol of the necessity of student-led advocacy and administrative transparency. The Vance Day of Service, held annually in the community park, now drew thousands of participants from across the state, teachers, engineers, computer scientists, and community organizers, all drawn by the common purpose of ensuring that the institutional vulnerabilities of the past remained firmly buried. They had reclaimed the ground where Marcus had been silenced, turning it into a space where the voices of the youth were now the loudest, most protected element of the neighborhood's future. Detective Carver found himself in the twilight of his career, walking through the archives of the state one final time. He was a man who had seen the absolute limit of what one person can hide, and he had seen the absolute limit of what the system can recover. The file of the Marcus Vance investigation was now a multi-terabyte digital library, a record so detailed and so exhaustive that it could never be debated or distorted. He had spent his life chasing ghosts, but in the end, he had discovered that the ghosts were not ethereal, haunting remnants of the supernatural. They were simply human secrets waiting for the right light to expose them. The case was, in every sense of the word, complete. He stood in the silent, temperature-controlled vault, surrounded by the resolved records of 100 other lives, and he felt the profound, quiet weight of a career defined by the pursuit of the absolute truth. The city of Detroit, ever-changing and ever-resilient, had reached a point of stability that would have been unimaginable during the bleak, crumbling winter of 2011. The skyline had been reshaped, the demographics had shifted, and the institutions that once harbored the secrets of the past were now the pillars of a modern, interconnected urban society. The story of the classroom skeleton had faded from the front page, transitioning into the permanent record of the city's history, a chapter that was painful, dark, and utterly devastating, but one that served as the definitive anchor for the city's commitment to never again allow a child to fall into the gaps of a broken system. The boy in the wall was no longer a mystery to be solved. He was the catalyst for an entire generation of change, a memory etched in stone and data that would continue to exert its influence as long as the city continued to stand. In the final hours of the year, Carver made one last trip to the community park. The snow was falling, a soft, white shroud that covered the city in a peaceful, muffled stillness. He walked to the memorial stone, his footsteps the only sound on the park's empty paths. He stood before the name of Marcus Vance, the cold air biting at his cheeks, and he realized that the case had never really been about Derek Miller, or the grade fixing, or the technology that eventually caught the killer. It had been about the simple, fundamental human necessity of being remembered, of having one's existence acknowledged, validated, and protected, even long after the physical evidence had been stripped away by time. He tipped his hat to the monument, the silence of the winter night finally feeling like a homecoming, and turned to walk back to his car. The city lights glowed in the distance, a vibrant, steady horizon of a future that had finally reconciled with its past. The investigation was over, the truth was anchored, and for Marcus Vance, the long, cold wait was finally, irrevocably, at an end.